media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. This is Thanksgiving week, and as you might imagine, we're going to be doing some things that will be a little different. Generally, we certainly do want to educate you about how we can use this particular holiday in a way to educate our children, so we will talk about some of that. Matter of fact, I will get into a piece about Ken Burns in the second hour today. We'll have another piece which we'll be doing with Bill Federer tomorrow, and much, much more that you can certainly benefit from. And I recognize that it's amazing how Thanksgiving has changed. I remember when we thought we were doing really well on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving. If they let us out an hour early, we thought they were doing well. If you've been out and about, you will notice that almost all the students I know got out at noon last Friday, and they're off this entire week, which is, again, Thanksgiving week. So things have changed a little bit, but some things are just as we would have predicted there in Washington, D.C. I want to talk about the Epstein files. Decision coming down from the Supreme Court. It's only a tentative one, but that relates to a conversation we've had about gerrymandering. Some questions about the middle class, and maybe even a debate as to whether or not this Thanksgiving dinner will be as inexpensive as last or more expensive. And then we will spend some time at the bottom of the hour talking with Traveon McNeil about the ministry that they have there with Youth for Christ for the homelessness, a topic we have gotten into before. Chantel Pagan will be with us next hour. We'll talk about a Bible study that I think you'll be benefiting from. And before we're all through, we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. In particular, some very good pieces that have come out on when myths become media facts. And Dan McLaughlin has some things to say about at least the first episode of the Ken Burns miniseries, which does not bode well. If this is a preview of coming attractions, we might have to pull together some of our experts, one of whom, of course, will be on with us tomorrow. Bill Federer, one was on with us last week, Jerry Newcomb, but a variety of other individuals who might just want to provide an alternative view to some of the things that will be in the Ken Burns series. Have high respect for him, but also recognize if all you do is listen to some of your fellow liberal, very liberal, and almost revisionist historians, maybe you're not going to get the full truth about what happened in the founding of this country and in the American Revolution. So we have a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. First piece by Kim Strassel. She writes for the Wall Street Journal. And she says, Washington goes tabloid. Yes, we were fearful of this, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I thought I'd at least devote part of our first segment to the fact that it's almost as if TMZ and National Enquirer got together and decided, let's see if we can release all of these revelations, which are going to titillate the public, and I fear might even ruin the careers of individuals. Some maybe deserve it, but some maybe not. And again, what she said is what started as the Democrats' monomaniacal goal of tying Donald Trump to the deceased sex offender is set to become a bonfire of the political elite. It will be fueled by correspondence, hearsay, and accusations, the type that only law enforcement can compel and collect, and as a result will result usually in keeping some of these legal proceedings and making them public. But as I've pointed out before, just because a person is mentioned in a particular document doesn't necessarily mean they've done something wrong. But let's go to right now that one of the things that Donald Trump was saying is Epstein was a Democrat. He's a Democrat's problem, not the Republicans' problem. Ask Bill Clinton, Reid Hoffman, Larry Summers about Epstein. They know him well. First of all, let's acknowledge that there is going to be an attempt to actually get some testimony from Bill Clinton. The deposition went to Bill and Hillary Clinton. We'll see whether or not he defies that, but that has been issued by the House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer. And what about his flights on the so-called Lolita Express? Also, they're digging into a variety of others, and already you've seen some people, I think in this case, justifiably tarred by the Epstein files. One I just mentioned a minute ago, Larry Summers. You might say, okay, who is he? Well, he was the Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, later was president of Harvard University, but apparently does like young girls, and I'll leave it at that. You, of course, have also the implication that Hakeem Jeffries, who is a representative from New York and now the minority House leader, actually invited Epstein into a campaign fundraising dinner, which, by the way, was an invitation that took place after Epstein was found guilty. And, of course, you've had all sorts of people like Jasmine Crockett pointing out that I see that there was somebody by the name of Jeffrey Epstein that gave to an individual, by the way, who now serves as EPA director, but she apparently doesn't understand that there is more than one person named Jeffrey Epstein in this country. This Dr. Jeffrey Epstein is in New York, and Lee Elder was probably going to get a donation from him. But even if you didn't know there was more than one Jeffrey Epstein died 6 years ago, and that contribution took place after this. And, of course, we've had the one that we mentioned about Stacey Plaskett, who is the representative from the U.S. Virgin Islands, really just a delegate, but nevertheless showed correspondence and text messages between Jeffrey Epstein and her on even how to question one of the witnesses. So this has, in a sense, gone a little bit from bad to worse for the Democrats. And not to be outdone, one of the things that I really appreciate about this article, which I've posted by Kimberly Strassel, is that she also points out that the senator from Oregon, Ron Wyden, has decided not only to see if you could find some connection to Trump, which doesn't seem to exist. Well, let's now talk about corporations, and releasing a memo claiming that Epstein files show that J.P. Morgan Chase failed to report suspicious Epstein financial transactions to the Treasury. And so that is the case. And, of course, we have all sorts of other things. This one, of course, talking about Jasmine Crockett and Lee Zeldin and all the rest. And as Kimberly Strassel says near the end, this circus is nothing. This week's mudslinging comes courtesy of the initial House documents from the Epstein estate and from those the Justice Department didn't mind parting with. As more land, you can see this is, again, a preview of coming attractions. And if you are, once again, convinced that some of this is going to possibly affect people's lives, maybe destroy their reputations, you can see why at least one member of the House of Representatives, Clay Higgins, voted against releasing these documents, knowing full well what might happen. To be clear, I think it is important to have transparency. It is good to have these documents out. It's good for people to read them. But I do fear, as I've said before, some people that may be really innocent simply because their names show up on a document, that's enough. And it certainly was enough for Jasmine Crockett to point out that Representative Lee Zeldin received money from Dr. Jeffrey Epstein, but not the Jeffrey Epstein we all know about. This kind of mistake's going to happen, and it's going to ruin some lives, I fear. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On a recent episode of his program, Bill Maher was trying to understand why New York elected Zohran Mamdani. In response, an economist on Substack wrote an open letter to Bill Maher. Bill Maher understood why people are angry about the economy, especially in New York. He then asked for someone to explain this economy. He currently identified the problem, the gap between the haves and the have-nots. On the one hand, he acknowledged that the stock market is at an all-time high. On the other hand, ordinary people can't afford basic necessities. In the open letter, The Economist explains that the state of the economy stems from a massive bipartisan failure to confront America's monetary policy. Both Republicans and Democrats have been negligent in challenging the status quo of the Federal Reserve. He then shows a graph of the increasing money supply, followed by this graph of the widening inequality gap. The top 10%, and especially the top 1%, get richer while the rest of Americans don't feel anything. The Economist correctly blames both political parties and the Federal Reserve. We have $38 trillion in a national debt and a Federal Reserve that feels compelled to intervene and bail out the entire economy. But I would add another important factor: broken money. That's the title of the book by Lynn Alden and a chapter in the book by Larry Lepard. As they oftentimes say, fix the money, fix the world. Yet we have a reckless monetary policy in this country. We also need sound money. These economic challenges won't be solved with a business-as-usual approach, nor will they be solved by electing socialists to political office. We need to focus on the money printing that rewards the elites and hurts everyone else. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's go back and talk about the economy for a few minutes. My commentary today, Bill Maher and the economy. We'll get back to that in just a minute, but we did mention that about a week ago, and I did a commentary on it, and I do encourage you to read it. Also, there's a link there to the economist who wrote an open letter to Bill Maher, so you can see some of the graphs and charts that we sometimes show on the screen here if you're watching, but later on you can look at those and see exactly what's going on. But it relates also to my second article, The Middle Class is Buckling Under Almost 5 Years of Persistent Inflation, as illustrated by the what I call Thanksgiving Day Wars. And that is, every year there are various institutions that have said, how much more expensive is Thanksgiving this year than last year? And the other day I pointed out that we were getting two different assessments. One that came from Wells Fargo, and you might imagine that's the one that President Donald Trump quoted. And then you had another one that ABC quoted, and I wasn't quite sure where that was from because they never gave that documentation. But Walmart has done one as well, and this is where you've started doing some fact-checking on this. President Trump, it says, has been touting the fact that Walmart says that their Thanksgiving bundle is down 25% from last year. Well, that sounds great, as I said, until you look at the fine print, because Walmart has done the very same thing that the government does with the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. What do you put in the basket? What do you leave out of the basket? And they said in order to save on Thanksgiving at Walmart this year, you have to forego, are you ready? Sweet potatoes, marshmallows, cornbread, onions, celery, chicken broth, poultry season, cranberry sauce, pecan pie, and whipped cream. But Walmart has added a box of mac and cheese to make up for some of that. So, as I have said so many times, tell me what the basket is, and I'll tell you whether or not I believe it or not. And I don't believe that the Consumer Price Index has a representative basket of the kinds of goods. And so when it says that inflation has only been 3% this year, well, yes, but it said it was only 9% when Joe Biden was in office, and we know it was higher than that as well. The first thing I might just point out, to be fair to this president or any individual that is talking about prices, is to remind you that when we talk about inflation, inflation is cumulative. That is, it isn't up and down. Yeah, the percentage isn't, but it's like a ratchet that goes up. Here's a good example. Let's say during the year in which Joe Biden was president, it was 9%. And then let's say the next year it was 3%. Well, yes, but it's 3% from the previous year. But if you look back 2 years, it's up 9 plus 3 That's 12%. You with me on this? So unless you have a deflation economy, and the Federal Reserve will not allow that to happen, and this is something we will get to later in this week, you're always going to have a problem with inflation because it is cumulative. Which brings us to the second article, which is written by two individuals with the Wall Street Journal, because they point out America's middle class is weary. After nearly 5 years of high prices, many middle-class earners thought life would be more affordable by now. Costs for goods and services are 25% above where they were in 2020. Accurate as always, even though the inflation rate is below its recent 2022 high. Certain essentials like coffee, ground beef, car repairs are up markedly. The Pew Research Center defines the middle class broadly as anyone having a household income between $66,000 and $200,000, and that depends on where you live. I won't go into all the details with that now, but they point out that perpetual sticker shock is making many within the group feel worse about both their finances and the future of the country. They're hunting for bargains, and of course, cost of living issues are what actually probably elected governors in both New Jersey and in Virginia, and even the mayor of New York City. These dogged Joe Biden, but this issue of affordability, which is the current buzzword, has been something that Democrats weren't talking about when Joe Biden was president, but boy, they're talking about it now. And a survey done by the University of Michigan showed that 44% of middle-income respondents said their financial situation was worse than it was a year ago, while 23% said it was better. And of course, this is a good example of people expecting it to happen overnight. Just to remind you, President Trump was this time last year just elected and did not actually come into office until the latter part of January. But we'll leave that because sooner or later it will even more so be his problem. And of course, the problem is when the panic hit, many in the middle class were able to save money more after getting government stimulus checks. So in some respects, they felt wealthy for a little bit of time. And there was also an expanded child tax credit. As by the start of 2022, people in this range had more than $500 billion in extra savings. But then inflation began to pick up, as we've talked about before, peaked at 9.1% June of 2022. And by the beginning of 2025, the middle class had spent down all of the excess savings they had to keep up with the higher costs. Wage increases did not go up, and there you found what it was. And so again, they give you lots of examples. One here, an English teacher, lives outside of Richmond, Virginia, voted for the Democrat for governor, and said her hope was that this affordability program pushed by the Abigail Spanberger would actually work for her, but nevertheless is an individual making $90,000 a year teaching middle schoolers during the day and night, but then she's at school before 9 a.m., followed a 2-hour midday break, gets home around 9:30 at night, and talks about all the expenses that she has. And that's exactly why this issue of affordability has been kind of the campaign theme in 2025, and I predict will be the campaign theme in 2026. So go back to my commentary for just a minute, because this open letter written by an economist to Bill Maher was trying to answer his question. Why do we have such a divergence between the haves and the have-nots? The have-nots and the have-yachts, as some people have said. And he points out that we essentially have a K-shaped economy. You can look at the graph. We've shown it here before. Those people that are part of the 1% or even the 10% income profile that have their assets that are part of their wealth, those assets have appreciated because it takes more dollars to pay for those assets. So individuals at the top 10%, especially the top 1%, get richer, while the rest of us don't feel much of anything. And that's because if you're on this hamster wheel trying to just have enough money and get enough money to pay for groceries and gas and rent, you recognize that. And of course, the real reason that very few people want to talk about, especially members of Congress, is we have broken money. And, of course, give you quotes from two books that I highly recommend by Lynn Alden, Broken Money, and by Larry Lepard, The Big Print, in which I am sad to say I suspect we're going to be seeing more money being printed, and the more money being printed means the dollars in your wallet, the dollars in your purse, the dollars in your pocketbook are going to be worth less. And so those on the bottom end of the spectrum and the financial circumstances are going to have fewer experiences that are going to be positive, and those who have assets, and this is land and gold and whatever it might be, stocks, bonds, whatever, they're going to see those appreciate. And of course, houses are appreciating too, but it's just a good illustration of why we see this remarkable dichotomy. And it was a question that Bill Maher asked on his program. Glad that he did, and I'm glad that there was at least one economist that took the time to write him an open letter, which we have. You can go to the Substack and see that. You can see the graphs for net personal wealth for the top 1%, the top 10%, then for the 50 to 90 percentile, and then for the bottom half. And you can kind of see exactly since the 1970s, especially since we went off the gold standard in 1971, how printing more money has not been a good thing for especially most Americans, but it's been a great thing for the very top 1%, top 10%. So those are some pieces that I wanted to put on the table. Some other things we're going to talk about today, but we will come back first and learn a little bit about this ministry to the homeless. This comes from the organization known as Youth for Christ, and Traveon McNeil will be with us, and then we'll come back and give you some updates on some other important issues, including the decision by the Supreme Court to, for now, keep the Texas Republican-friendly congressional map in existence, but more to come, and we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we are privileged to have come to the microphone now Traveon McNeil. He serves as the City Life National Ministry Specialist for Youth for Christ. Just reflecting on that, it's hard to imagine, but 50 years ago, I was one of the leaders in a Youth for Christ outreach. Man, that was back in 1974 and 75. So that's 50 years ago. But nevertheless, things have changed rather dramatically since then. Special emphasis there on youth ministry and community building initiatives. He really is working to enhance the life of young people as well as staff and volunteers that lead and want to encourage them with their academic, social, emotional, and spiritual growth. So, Traveon, thank you for being with us and thank you for your ministry.
And thank you so much for having me.
Talk about this for just a minute because, first of all, I would highly recommend the organization Youth for Christ, and we have a link to that on the website, but we also have a link to the specialty that you're a part of, and that is what is called City Life. And that, I think, is an initiative that we want to dig into, but for just a minute, give us some background just on Youth for Christ itself.
Sure. Youth for Christ serves and is a part of the national movement, or international movement, rather, Youth for Christ International. And so Youth for Christ is a chapter, Youth for Christ is a chapter of YFC International, which means that we're participating all over the globe where young people are being impacted and reached and mentored and loved on for the sake of drawing them closer to Jesus Christ and the eventuality that they would give their lives to him. So it's a really powerful place. It started back in the 70s. I'm glad to hear that you were a part of that, or it was 70 years ago, rather. I'm glad to hear that you were a part of that.
Yes. Well, again, for people that might say, well, I don't know much about that, there's a place on the website. You can go to yfc.net, and you can find out more about how to give, how you can join. You can find out where there's a chapter nearby and all of the rest. And so all of that is on the website. But I thought one of the things that we really wanted to dig down into is your ministry, City Life, because in some respects, that is a very significant need, and I'm just thrilled that you are part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So City Life is built and organized to present a holistic gospel to young people who are in under-resourced or underserved communities. In the last couple of years, we've learned that that's not just people who are in urban or inner city areas, but also people who are in rural areas. So it's been really impactful to see the growth and the mission being increased as far as City Life is concerned.
And again, a lot of this is kind of relational, it's holistic, it's kind of community-based. It's something that is really, in a sense, goes beyond just, sharing the gospel. It is trying to address those needs. And I thought for just a minute, let's talk about this. I'm holding up the booklet I did a while back on a biblical view on homelessness, a topic we come to from time to time. And I know that one aspect of your ministry of City Life is this homelessness ministry. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, so City Life, like you said, is a holistic ministry, meaning that we're not content with kind of the old adage of, if you teach a man, you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach him a fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. We are taking that a step further and saying, hey, they also need fishing poles. And so we'll make sure that we give them fishing poles and the tools they need to really dial in and do this. And while Youth for Christ is focused on the 11 to 19-year-olds, we believe that by impacting young people with not only finding partners and places where they can be and lay their head, but giving them strategies, financial strategies, and teaching them all sorts of holistic things that will help them get by and help them thrive. We believe that just because we're impacting that 11 to 19-year-old, they get to go and they get to impact their families, thus helping us be in a space where we're providing support and providing resources to help people get back on their feet and help in the homelessness crisis.
We're talking with Traveon McNeil, and again, he is with the City Life National Ministry, and we have a link to it on the website, which I would encourage you to find out some more. And Traveon, let's, if we can, talk about some of these challenges, because they are major, and in some respects, we have talked before about a culture of poverty. Poverty begets more poverty. Matter of fact, one of the verses in the Old Testament, the ruin of the poor are their poverty, and there's a sense in which you're talking about violence, homelessness, fatherlessness, abuse, neglect, addiction. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you face when you are out there trying to minister to these individuals?
Absolutely. What I can say is that I remember in the Old Testament when it says that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And that's something that we often come into contact with and see in our ministry efforts, that young people, a lot of times, some of the things they do is right in their own eyes. And so if they are going to a corner grocery store and they pick up some chips on the way out that they didn't pay for, that might have been right in their own eyes. They might have seen, hey, I need to eat. Hey, my family might need something to eat. And so I'll just grab this. And we know all that's wrong. And deep down, I believe they know it's wrong as well. But because it's right in their own eyes, that's why they kind of do this stuff. And we know that generationally, this type of lifestyle, these type of choices that result in things you listed, like violence or abuse or neglect, addiction, and fatherlessness, those actually just play a cycle generationally. And so we want to stop that cycle and be a place that interjects like, hey, no, there's actually a better way. And that way is with Jesus. And he informs and speaks to all of these different things, especially when they're so nuanced and there's so many different degrees to which these things happen.
You know, and one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is the value of faith-based organizations, and whether you're dealing with one of the reasons for homelessness is the issue of addiction, for example, that these faith-based drug programs are much more effective than government ones, because sometimes these problems aren't economic. These are spiritual and psychological issues that faith-based organizations can deal with. There are also, of course, the real need, as I think you're already alluding to change some of the patterns. If you've come from a broken home, a dysfunctional home, you haven't necessarily learned about the value of work and reward, and maybe you're around individuals that have really inculcated into you kind of an entitlement mindset or laziness or a variety of other things. There are all sorts of ways in which the church and faith-based organizations can help in a way that, say, government programs, which really cannot get into the spiritual issues and the religious issues too much, only can provide funds. And it does seem to me that if we really want to deal with this issue of homelessness, sometimes you have to get inside the minds and hearts of individuals, don't you?
Absolutely. I think it's a tremendous effort to go and to look inside of the things that maybe cause these things, whether it's spiritual or natural things. I know the Bible tells us in Revelation that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And so something that YFC does is make sure that we share our testimony so that young people know, hey, I've been there too, or I've had some hard times too, and here's how God's helped me through that. Like you were alluding to, there's so much of that struggle is such a spiritual space. Even the doubt that I believe, the statement, I don't believe that God can provide for me, is huge in those spaces. And when we correct that statement and kids and young people begin to see the falseness of that statement and are aligned and informed of the truth that God can provide. He's a provider. He's Jehovah Jireh. He can provide for us. They begin to see life change happen in their lives.
Well, let's see if we can take a break. And as we take a break, I would encourage you to find out a little bit more about Youth for Christ. You can go to yfc.net or just follow the link. But I, again, have focused a lot of our time and attention here, and we'll come back and get into a little bit more about city life. But there is, of course, campus life and campus life military, even a Deaf Teen Quest, which relates very much to our second hour guest. We'll be talking about Deaf Bible Society. We'll get into that next hour. Even one on juvenile justice ministry. Then there's parent life. There's, the YFC Core, even YFC Camp. So just a lot of things that you may want to know about. So whether you are in your church having a ministry to the urban areas, whether you have young people that maybe would benefit from some of the things that happen in a typical campus life event, we've given you some links there so that you can click on that button that says Find a Chapter and plug in there. But also, as we are going to a break, I hope you also think about whether or not you might want to support this ministry itself, because we do believe that faith-based organizations will have a much greater success for all sorts of very good reasons we've talked about on this program, whether it's prison ministry, whether it's homeless ministry, whether it's drug ministry, whatever it might be. There is such a need for us to bring the gospel into these areas, the Bible and biblical motivated individuals into those areas. So we'll come back and spend just a few more minutes talking with Traveon McNeil. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Traveon McNeil with us for just a few more minutes. Let me again encourage you to find out a little bit more about Youth for Christ. And Traveon, just maybe an open-ended question. What can we as listeners to Point of View do to support you and help you out in your ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best things that you could do would be to figure out how you could be involved or how your church could partner with YFC chapters across the country. So many times we get financial donors, and those are great, and those help move our mission forward. But at the end of the day, our young people need people to be in relationship with. They need people who walk alongside them and mentor and then guide them, and just be honest with them about where they are in life and where the hope of the gospel that exists for them. And so one of the best things that you could do is by going to our website and looking at how to get involved and finding out if there's a chapter that's near you, and potentially saying, hey, I know, I may know someone, or it may be me that could get involved with this ministry. And let's go and check it out and see if it's something that you might be interested in, and see if God might be pushing you towards spending relational time with young people.
There's so many young people I know that need mentors, and so many old people like me, since I'm the old guy here, that should be mentors. And I've done some of that in the past. And the things that sometimes we take for granted are actually revolutionary. You know, the emphasis upon planning, organization, being careful about issues certainly are all ways in which you can help. And again, I want to come back to the theme I mentioned just a few minutes ago, because 20 years ago, as I mentioned in my booklet, Joel John Roberts wrote a book, How to Increase Homelessness. Now, he wrote that tongue-in-cheek, but he was pointing out that he was looking at the time, all the various groups, all these homeless services and all that, and he was concluding that they all were providing maybe housing or assistance, but nobody was talking about how to even dismantle the homeless service system, or maybe how can we get people off the streets. 4 years ago, Michael Schellenberger wrote his book, San Francisco, Sicko, How Progressives Ruined Cities, or even Christopher Rufo, Homelessness in America, just talking about the fact that these government programs most of the time don't work because you need, as you just pointed out, kind of face-to-face. I will give some credit to, for example, the mayor in Houston, Sylvester Turner, that started maybe a tough love approach. But even there, the bottom line is, certainly we need policies and programs from the government to address these issues. But if we really want to actually give people a chance so that eventually we can see that, and Scott Turner used this the other day, see some of these programs as like a trampoline where you bounce on it and then you bounce up to where you need to get. We want to not just provide a handout for the rest of your life, but a hand up to get you to a position of where you are using your gifts. It seems to me that that's why I'm so excited about various faith-based organizations like what you do at Youth for Christ to provide a hand up and give individuals hope for the future and see that they really can be independent and they can really be successful in this new world.
Absolutely.
So it does seem to me that one of the things we're going to have to talk about is how people can partner with you. So if they go to the website, show them maybe where to click, because one is to find a chapter, then also to figure out if they want to click on some of those buttons, maybe they'd like to get involved just by giving, and then find out not only giving their money, but maybe giving their time and their talents. Can you talk about how that would actually unfold?
Sure. So there are a couple of different ways to give with YFC. And so if you want to give locally to your area that you're in, you would go to the Find a Chapter, and there will be a drop list there to show 110 chapters. And you can sort those chapters by state. So I know there are a couple of states that we don't serve, unfortunately, or are just starting to serve. Like New Mexico would be a brand new area that we're serving. Each of those spaces will show you where a website for that chapter. And each website, each chapter can actually be given to individually. So if you want to give locally to where you are, I would go to the Find a Chapter section on our website and then search for a location that's close to you. and click on that, and they'll have more instructions on their particular websites for each chapter to give. If you have nowhere near you, no chapter near you, you can give online with our website by clicking on the Give button, and we have a giving tool that'll take you there. Alternatively, you could email email donations at yfc.net. Again, that's donations at yfc.net. And so those are two ways to give. You can also figure out how to join the movement. Maybe you're called to employment, and so that's an option on the website under Join. But also, again, that using that Find a Local Chapter button, an option on our website, will direct you towards a local chapter who you could possibly get involved with your time there as well.
And again, I might just mention that as I've looked through the list of the 110 different chapters, not only chapters in the lower 48, but also chapters in Anchorage, Alaska, and Honolulu, Hawaii, and others. And it's funny that you mentioned New Mexico, because we were just broadcasting about 2 weeks ago from our radio station there in New Mexico, and I think they'll be excited about that. And just about anywhere that you happen to be, you probably within the state have an opportunity to find out a little bit more about Youth for Christ and about this City Life ministry. So again, those are some resources, but one last time, maybe can you point individuals to some strategies they could begin to develop in their church? Because if you just start looking around, you can see that there are some great opportunities for ministry, and you don't have to go overseas to do ministry. You can just walk down the block, can't you?
Yeah, you can. YFC is really, really concerned, and concerned is probably the wrong word, but really, really adamant that even churches begin to practice some of the strategies that we have. And so we do have what's called YFC for churches.
Mm-hmm.
And so a 3-story for churches is that teaches everyone our kind of method of relational teaching to give and to spend our time and to practice kind of that 3-story living, which very briefly means, my story, your story, and God's story, and finding out where all 3 of those stories connect and bringing someone to the gospel through that. And so that stuff is there. And if you email training at yfc.net, they can provide a curriculum for you to walk through with your church, with people at your church, on how to implement this relational evangelism method that we use here at YFC.
Well, again, I appreciate the work that you're doing there, Traveon, and appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you. It was great. My pleasure.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, as you've already heard me mention, for those of you that may know someone who is deaf, we'll talk briefly about this Deaf Bible Society that began about 5 years ago. Also, of course, mention our booklet on homelessness. As you've heard me say before, oftentimes what we do is make it available on a PDF, so you can do a search on the website, pointofview.net, and find some information. And if you can't find it or you want to actually get a booklet, you can contact us, because we just think this is another ministry that you and the church need to consider. When we come back, though, I do want to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking about this new addition to the Bible Society, and then we'll finally, as we end the second hour, talk about some of the myths that become media facts. This has become a chronic problem at a time when we can do a search and find out that some of these myths, some of these conspiracies are false. We seem to have more proliferating than ever before. And then just thought before we're done, I'll talk about the first episode of the Ken Burns mini-series. Many things we like about it, a few things got some questions about, so we'll try to give you an honest assessment. But that all is coming up in the next hour. We need to take a break. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's see if we can get into a couple issues in the news, and we'll get back to some of the interviews we have planned. First of all, the Supreme Court actually ruled on Friday that at least they will temporarily allow Texas to use its newly redrawn Republican-friendly congressional voting map in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, we've been clear from the beginning, but it's worth mentioning again that this mid-decade rearranging and gerrymandering, first of all, I don't like gerrymandering in the first place. We're never going to get rid of that, I hate to say. But yes, we should either say any kind of reevaluation of the congressional map is appropriate, or we then need to say something like, then if it isn't, we should go back to the Constitution, which is every 10 years. So, nevertheless, for some of us that have been talking about this idea of gerrymandering, at the moment, the decision has been made to not accept the local decision that came from a divided panel, a 2-1, that had sided with a civil rights organization saying that this was an unconstitutional gerrymander because it involved race. In some respects, it also relates back to the Supreme Court decision that's going to be coming down on the 1965 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in particular. Civil Rights Act 1964, Voting Rights Act 1965. So I just wanted to give you that brief update. It's something we've been following. It will, I think, ultimately have an impact on the 2026 elections, but I wanted you to know about that, and it's just one of those pieces of information I thought I'd slip in while we were connecting with our next guest. And our next guest is Chantel Pagan, who is the president and CEO for the Deaf Bible Society, and she has been that since 2020. And before that, actually was involved with the Deaf Bible in 2012, including the Deaf Bible's formal incorporation in 2015. She is fluent, as you might imagine, in American Sign Language as well as English and Spanish, and really wanting to reach out to deaf populations. I've said before that one of the very significant unreached people groups in the world are the deaf population for a variety of reasons. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. But her vision is to see the world where deaf people are not only included, but actively participating in this global Christian community. So, Chantel, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me with you today.
I hope you can speak up a little bit so we can hear you a little bit better. But first of all, I'd love to know your background because I tried to give it briefly, but I'm sure there's a lot more to that as well because of your desire to really have deaf people be part of the community that is really one that is being unfortunately ignored. I think I saw some statistics saying, 98% of deaf population are almost unreached people groups. What have you found?
Yes, that's accurate. And so this is my 18th year on mission in pursuit to seeing deaf people have access to the gospel. And it's been an exciting journey, but it's also been very eye-opening. As you shared, the deaf communities around the world, which there are 350 plus unique sign languages, and very, very diverse deaf communities culturally around the world, waiting to know and have access to the hope of the gospel in the language that they know best, which is their heart sign language, visual communication. Because they've been unheard, they've been unseen for many, many years. And so our work at Deaf Bible Society is committed to providing scripture into the world's sign languages and to pursue a day where deaf people are not the largest unchurched community in the world, but that access and inclusion would be the norm.
Let's again just even illustrate that. One of the questions on your website is, why don't deaf people just read the Bible? Well, you point out as many as 80% of deaf children in some countries never receive access to formal education. For those who can read, written language is a second language that requires extra effort. So in some respects, even when maybe compare it to a ministry to the blind, and when I was growing up, the church that I attended was very close to the California Institute for the Blind. We oftentimes would have blind students in class, but they could hear, of course, even if they could not see. They also many times had Braille Bibles. So in some respects, they were still sort of integrated into the circumstances that existed even in that church. In my church that we have today, we do have an outreach for the deaf, but it is more difficult for all sorts of reasons that I think we've already illustrated, and that is, at least in this country, they speak English, they can read English, but in some parts of the world, in most parts of the world, that really does not exist. So that's one of the biggest challenges, isn't it?
Yeah, that continues to be an underlying difference culturally for our hearing communities to understand about deaf people, that they have their own language, grammar, structure, and cultural norms. And so with that, as a hearing individual, you and I grew up having access from the time of birth and even before to start developing our language, which would lead us eventually to orthography, the written print that we understand and can communicate with on a daily basis. For deaf individuals, when they grow up, they don't hear the m, the b, the g that eventually lead us to the formation of reading. And so from a literacy standpoint, it makes a whole lot of sense that their language and their way of processing communication would be visual. And so what we know today is that visual people, like our deaf communities, need visual Bibles. They need Bibles in their languages, and they need Bibles that are in video format to engage with and to receive so that they can to have equal and equitable understanding of the gospel and of the opportunity to be in community with God's church.
So again, let's see if we can take a break. When we come back, I want to get into this because, as we've already pointed out, there are more than 350 unique sign languages. But how many sign languages have a video Bible translation? I think that will shock you. And again, just some of the very significant facts and figures, which I think you would certainly want to apply in your own church if you have. But also, as we start looking nationwide and worldwide, it's a much more significant issue. And for those of you that have ever been to the Museum on the Bible, there is a place in one of these rooms where they have all the Bible translations. And what is so intriguing is to see some of those Bible translations that you can pull out and read, but then to realize that many of those are just dummy copies because there are translations that need to exist. And when we come back, I want to talk about what still would need to be provided for individuals who are deaf. And you can begin to think about that not only in terms of your own church, your own community, even in this nation, but then worldwide. So I thought this would be something that would be during this Thanksgiving week, another opportunity for considering ministry. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, we do have a link to deafbiblesociety.com. You can go there directly. Of course, we have a link there, and we have information about Chantel as well as the work that she is doing. And if you are learning about this for the first time, well, join the crowd. We're all learning together, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On a recent episode of his program, Bill Maher was trying to understand why New York elected Zohran Mamdani. In response, an economist on Substack wrote an open letter to Bill Maher. Bill Maher understood why people are angry about the economy, especially in New York. He then asked for someone to explain this economy. He currently identified the problem: the gap between the haves and the have-nots. On the one hand, he acknowledged that the stock market is at an all-time high. On the other hand, ordinary people can't afford basic necessities. In the open letter, the economist explains that the state of the economy stems from a massive bipartisan failure to confront America's monetary policy. Both Republicans and Democrats have been negligent in challenging the status quo of the Federal Reserve. He then shows a graph of the increasing money supply, followed by this graph of the widening inequality gap. The top 10%, and especially the top 1%, get richer while the rest of Americans don't feel anything. The economist correctly blames both political parties and the Federal Reserve. We have $38 trillion in a national debt and a Federal Reserve that feels compelled to intervene and bail out the entire economy. But I would add another important factor: broken money. That's the title of the book by Lynn Alden and a chapter in the book by Larry Lepard. As they oftentimes say, fix the money, fix the world. Yet we have a reckless monetary policy in this country. We also need sound money. These economic challenges won't be solved with a business-as-usual approach, nor will they be solved by electing socialists to political office. We need to focus on the money printing that rewards the elites and hurts everyone else. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Chantel Pagan, who is the president and CEO for the Deaf Bible Society. If you'd like to know more about that, go to deafbiblesociety.com. Chantel, we've talked about the fact that there are hundreds of unique sign languages, but let's see if we now can maybe give people a sense of the challenge, because how many Bibles do we have that are in this sign language? And as far as I know, just one, and that's the American Sign Language Bible. Is that true?
That's correct. Deaf Bible Society has been committed to partnering with organizations around the world to translate Scripture. And of all the sign languages that exist today, there is only one language that has a full Bible from Genesis to Revelations, and that is an American Sign Language. This work took 40 years to complete by wonderful deaf friends and partners out of Deaf Missions. And it was actually because of an accelerated factor of unity between the church, many nonprofit organizations like Deaf Bible Society and others coming around to say, how do we bring about urgency to see this work be done faster and go farther than it ever has before? That project was completed in 2020, and we celebrate this year that we have 91 other languages with translation and portions of Scripture available on our Deaf Bible application and on the web. But much remains still to be done, as you can imagine.
I would certainly say so. One of the other things on your website, over 70 million people worldwide, sign language is their first, or in many cases, their only language they use daily, the only one they know, and it's what you might call their heart language. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yes. For the worldwide population of the deaf community, the World Federation of the Deaf presents that at about 1% of every community, you'll have deaf native signers. And so for everyone listening today, I just would encourage you during this Thanksgiving week to think that everywhere you go, everywhere you step, 1% of your community accesses communication through sign language. That won't matter if you're here in the United States or in a remote part of the world elsewhere. There are deaf individuals who communicate visually through a sign language, who are waiting to have community and have great community amongst deaf friends, but are also looking for inclusion in the broader sense of the world's population.
Wow. Well, we can talk about how some of the churches listening right now can use this. First of all, you mentioned in passing, but it's worth talking about your Deaf Bible app, because that might be a first step for a number of individuals, and that, I believe, you can actually put on your phone, can't you?
Absolutely. I love when we get to encourage other hearing allies for a simple way to present the gospel to deaf people in their communities. It's as simple as downloading the Deaf Bible app on your phone and having it ready and available. You know, meeting and encountering people of different cultures can often be like and feel like when you want to maybe purchase a new car and you're like, oh, I saw this blue car and no one else has this blue car. And then all of a sudden you purchase this blue car and you're driving down the street and you see them on every corner. And that's been my experience when encouraging deaf friends to take a notice, to see the people around you differently, and to be ready and available. All you have to do is turn your phone around and show them the Deaf Bible app. There's things that the Bible will communicate directly to their heart that you might not have the signs for. But it's just that gesture of openness, of seeing someone and embracing a new point of view.
Let's talk about churches again. There is an opportunity where people can find a deaf church near you. And so I would certainly want to talk about that. But then I think, if I understand this right, there's a place where you could add a deaf ministry to your directory or something of that nature, so that in some respects for a community that's underserved, there can be an outreach even through your own church. Can you explain?
That's right. We love our Deaf Church Wear network. If you were to go online to deafchurchwear.com, you would see hundreds of ministries around the world that are serving our deaf communities. And if you and your church are one that are serving and have a deaf ministry, we'd love to have your information. We have about 17,000 deaf individuals on a weekly basis looking for a place to engage with the church. And so if your ministry is one of those places, we want to ensure that you have an access point for them to find you. And if you're not, you can search for deaf ministries and churches in your area to be in prayer for and to potentially partner with, and see if there are ways that together you guys can serve your local community in partnership.
Where can you go to maybe find somebody who could be a deaf interpreter? I know that we are blessed to have some in my own church, and that they oftentimes sit off to the side, and then even lots of times they will gather together in a place for lunch, and one of the teachers will be speaking, and they'll be providing interpretation. But I suspect that's a real need that some of the churches have right now as they're hearing this broadcast.
Absolutely. Well, a great first step would be to email us at info@deafbiblesociety.com, and we'd love to get you connected to the most local expression of an interpreting agency in your community.
Well, again, one of the other things you have there is 10 ways deaf people worship, and it does seem to me that that's something that in our own churches we need to have some kind of understanding about. Can you speak to that issue for a minute?
Absolutely. One thing that we love to do is to provide resources to churches, both deaf and hearing, on ways to better serve deaf people and to understand and embrace their own cultural norms, their language, and their distinct and unique giftings that the Lord has given them to serve the world and to bring the Great Commission to fruition. And so in churches, there are ways that deaf people love to worship. And as you can imagine, for deaf people not hearing sound, they can still feel vibrations. So in some deaf contexts, they'll have a huge drum beating, and you can feel it all the way through every sense of your body. And it's a beautiful way and expression that they sign to the beat, these beautiful worship songs. And it's something to embrace, and it's something that I hope every person has the opportunity to experience one day. But if your church, your ministry, or your school is looking for a training or a resource on how to better understand the deaf community and to better engage, we'd love to partner with you. We'd love to see how we can come alongside you and bring some of these trainings and these devotionals and resources that we have available on Deaf Churchware and the Deaf Bible app alive within your context.
I might also mention if individuals would want to contribute. I know there's some that have said, well, I want to contribute so that we can put the Bible in another language. There's a way in which people can contribute so that you can actually be part of translating that into a sign language of the heart language of one of those individuals overseas.
Yes. Since 2022, we have seen more progress in sign language scripture access than all of history prior to that point. This is dramatic acceleration, and the results of expanding translation teams around the globe is just getting started, but we can do so much more when more resources are presented. And so this opportunity to invest in deaf translation projects around the world is one we would invite you to partner with us in. Our heart's desire is that all deaf people would have access to full scripture one day. We're taking that day by day, moment by moment with the translation teams that we're supporting around the globe, empowering local deaf churches to distribute and translate scripture in ways like we've never seen before. So we invite you into this historic moment. We believe God is opening up the way for deaf people of every nation to have access to his word. And one way to support that is by giving financially. But in partnership with that, we can't say it enough. We would love for you to be in prayer with us.
Again, deafbiblesociety.com. We have all the links there. We also have links to social media. And Chantel, we appreciate you being with us today here on Point of View, and thank you for your very appropriate and very important ministry. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful and blessed Thanksgiving.
Well, again, this is our Thanksgiving week, and we thought it would be good for you to know about another ministry that probably would be new to you, but I suspect some of you already are thinking about what you could do to reach out to even the deaf community through your own church. So that is a link if you're concerned about getting God's word into other languages. I'd never thought about, I think most of us never thought about getting it into the heart language for those who are actually learning through sign language, but that is, again, a resource we have on the website, pointofview.net. Some final comments in the last half hour, all that coming up right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, last half hour, let me just, as a program note, mention that Wendy Patrick will be with us tomorrow. We've had her on before, and she really brings a lot to the table in terms of discernment. That's always a great skill for us to learn, whether it's Thanksgiving week or any other time. And she was recommended to us by Bill Geisler. And one of the things that was kind of interesting, or David Geisler, I'm thinking of the brother, David Geisler had recommended, and I said, well, we've had her on before, but let's have her on again because we can learn a great deal about discernment. Having been a prosecutor, having written about that, I think that'll be a great conversation. And then because it is Thanksgiving week, we'll have Bill Federer on with us, and he has a book that reminds us of what it was like in the 16th and 17th century. Even before, of course, we finally got to having in the 17th century the 1620, and that is the Pilgrims. And anyway, they're just all sorts of great things that we will learn from them. Also, some other good articles that I've already posted for tomorrow's program. So we are ready to go. And then, of course, we will focus on some other important issues on Wednesday. One of those is Robert Woodson. As we are talking about American history, every once in a while, I do mention that let's not whitewash American history. There are some very dark chapters in American history. So even as we will in the next segment talk about the Ken Burns mini-series on the American Revolution, let's also acknowledge that this is also the history of slavery, of a civil war, of segregation, of Jim Crow and the rest. So Robert Woodson put together a book a while back, and I have pulled it off my shelf to talk about it again with him on Wednesday, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing Americans' History, looking at the issue of race and a number of other issues, including wanting to, if you will, rescue American history from revisionist. There are two kinds of revisionism, and neither are ones that we want to endorse. One has been the revisionism, which unfortunately we're starting to see more and more of, maybe even a little bit in the history, a miniseries by Ken Burns, but certainly in some of the books, which would look at only the negative aspects of American history, and in some respects talk about the fact that the American Revolution was fought to make slavery legal, which is not true, but it's part of the 1619 Project. So that revisionism is ahistorical and anti-historical. But there's also been, let's face it, sometimes within the Christian world, a revisionism to just blush and maybe blur out some of those negative stories, whether it's been the Indian Wars or slavery. And we want to be honest about both. So we will have an honest look about that with Robert Woodson on Wednesday. But with that as a background, it's a perfect setup for the next article that I've posted for you, and it comes from Beckett Adams, When Myths Become Media Facts. And it's funny that his opening story is one that relates to the American Revolution. He points about the fact that there was a CNN guest who recently claimed that Thomas Jefferson raped a 14-year-old slave. He says, no one at the table challenged the contributor. The assertion was presented as an indisputable fact, and the panel moved on to other topics. And he says, first of all, what's the excuse today for anyone not to double check, given the fact that we have Google searches and everything else? He says, though most academics and even caretakers of Monticello agree that Jefferson fathered several children with a teenage slave named Sally Hemings, well known, some scholars, though a minority, have published extensive studies raising reasonable doubts. Maybe the count is true, maybe not. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. But the point he's making is this. There is a difference between an incontestable fact and something we believe is probably true, especially when it comes to history, and that distinction has been lost. And he points out that what is so frustrating is that this incident he mentions on CNN is hardly the first of its kind. He says what's so frustrating right now is there are fewer excuses for said distortions. We no longer depend on massive archives of physical reports and records, having to sift through mountains of paperwork to find the truth. We no longer rely on oral history and traditions. Each of us keep essentially a supercomputer in our pocket all day, every day. It's always ready to share the world's accumulated knowledge with us. All it requires is a swipe of a finger or a few spoken commands. We're in the golden age for the curious. Want to know more about a topic? It's all right there at your fingertips. You only need to ask. So that's why he says it's exasperating then that theories, myths, and secondhand anecdotes should be allowed to go unchallenged and thus evolve into facts and eventually become the consensus view when the tools for double checking abound. He says, unfortunately, few seem interested in the simple act of fact-checking, which only makes it easier for half-baked beliefs and tales to take on the appearance of truth. He gives you some examples, of New York Times claim that the governor at the time of Alaska, Sarah Palin, who was then running as vice president, was the one that inspired a 2011 mass shooting in Tucson, Arizona. All this speculation, that came from an individual who is known to speculate quite often. Or this one I was unaware of, but I guess it has its own life on its own, that the tan suit that was worn by former President Barack Obama started out as a joke, saying that perhaps it was the worst scandal of his presidency that he wore a tan suit to a press conference, which is now evolved into, or probably better, morphed into something that President Obama had a scandal-free presidency because the only scandal he had was the fact that he wore a tan suit to a press conference. Obviously not the case. Obviously, President Obama did not have a scandal-free presidency, but is a good example, he says, of how a straightforward falsehood now is treated as truth. And he gives some other examples along the way, but some of them are very concerning because if you have received my recent booklet on political violence, he points out that there are various places where you can find that the right wing was completely responsible for political violence until 2013. Never mind that the numbers, as he said, have been manipulated, and he now gives you links. A lot of these that I post have HTML links, so that you can go to the HTML link and find the original article in which there were, including prison gangs, prison gang violence, and the rest, all put under right-wing violence to come to that solution, which is, of course, inaccurate. And then goes on to mention another one I've mentioned before, that State Senator John Hoffman and the House Speaker Melissa Hartman were targeted because of their politics. That's part of, again, that political violence issue, whereas the alleged gunman claimed that it was really the Democratic Minnesota Governor Tim Walz that ordered him to murder them and had been secretly trained by the U.S. military. And again, this is not a well person. And as a matter of fact, he also said that the governor had told him to kill off the senators so that Tim Walz could run as U.S. Senator. This is obviously not politically motivated. This was a person that was very deranged. So the point he's making is one of his all-time worst is every year when you come to the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, you have somebody who also wants to tell you that the Japanese generals were going to actually surrender and we didn't need to drop the bomb. Not true. He goes through quite a few of these, but I think you can get the point, and that is it is really important to check. I encourage you to fact check us. I encourage you to read the articles, including this one, which we've posted on the website today, pointofview.net. And he says, look, it's common for people to confuse legend for fact. The issue today is in this age of instant information, when you have in a sense, you have to practically beg your computer and phone to stop offering read more suggestions. When there's a newsletter boom, when there are 1,000 new TV shows, podcasts, and streaming documentaries every year, what good excuse is there for someone not double checking whether a story they've been hearing is accurate or not? And so the point is, we encourage you to check out even the stories we post here on Point of View and many other stories, because Beckett Adams warns us this tendency of how myths and legends and conspiracy theories eventually become media facts. And so he gives you many examples of those which maybe as you read through you thought were true, turns out they were not. So with that as a background, we'll come back and talk about the Ken Burns miniseries. That coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that one of the things that we are going to focus more and more of our time and attention on is at this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Just a great opportunity to once again teach American history. And if you go to our website right now, you'll see the banner that says Restoring America's Godly Heritage. So I'm always excited when you hear about something that is going to educate individuals. And, of course, the other day we talked about the fact that the Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch has been very concerned about the lack of civic education in America and is doing his part to make a difference in that regard. Actually has a children's book coming out, and we're thrilled that Ken Burns has developed a mini series on the American Revolution. But as this article by Dan McLaughlin points out, there are some real significant questions that come from just the first episode. We haven't seen all of it yet. I was in a Barnes & Noble bookstore the other day, and they actually have a book that goes with this series. And I picked it up, and I thought, well, maybe I could buy it. It's $80. $80. Okay. Now, at Barnes & Noble, they said you could get 50% off. So it's only $40. But it's not like I've got, this book buying account at Point of View to spend $40 on a book. But I think I might buy it now, because after reading Dan McLaughlin's piece, which we've posted for you, there apparently are going to be some kind of woke ideas that show up that maybe we need to counter. And so I'm already starting to think that once the series is out there and people have had a chance to watch it, let's see if we could bring on some people, like Bill Federer is going to be on with us tomorrow, or like Jerry Newcomb, who was on last week, or Thomas Kidd. By the way, I might highly recommend this new PragerU video out by Thomas Kidd, who's been on the program before, on the Great Awakening. Great piece. Or maybe Mark David Hall, did America have a Christian founding, or David Barton, or somebody like that? Maybe a group of individuals to go and give the part that isn't actually presented in this mini-series. Let's face it, Ken Burns, by his own definition, is a liberal. He's looking at things more from a secular point of view, not expecting that he's going to be able to pull out some of the really important principles of Americans' heritage and history by certainly looking at that from a set of glasses that are liberal and secular. And as Dan McLaughlin points out, as much as we love the series that Ken Burns did on the Civil War, I love all of his, jazz, baseball. I mean, how could you not like the Ken Burns series? He did get criticized a lot by his fellow liberals because he maybe bent over too much to the Southern view of the Civil War, and so maybe this time is making up for it. But nevertheless, I'm not going to go through this very lengthy piece by Dan McLaughlin, which goes on for, I guess, about 5 or 6 pages, and just pick one illustration, because Dan McLaughlin puts it this way. I had intended to watch the new Ken Burns miniseries on the American Revolution, report on its overall portrayal of the founding of our nation, but I didn't need to get very far into the counter before I found a big whopper. In the opening narration, which is preceded only by 2 quotations, one from Thomas Paine about the momentous nature of the struggle and one from a spokesman for the Iroquois Six Nations, is this argument that basically the United States and the idea of having 13 colonies was borrowed from the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. First of all, I have trouble even taking it seriously, but let's see if we can make our way through this. Dan McLaughlin says the Ken Burns is a master, and he doesn't pick his introductions without intending them to carry a message about the story he aims to tell. The message that this scene setting is plainly designed to send is the founding of the United States was in some sense derivative of the Iroquois ideas prompted by Iroquois recommendations and or modeled on Iroquois institutions, and he says none of this is true. First of all, he leapfrogs into a speech that was given by Benjamin Franklin, which is actually a full decade later than when you even were talking about what the Iroquois nation was dealing with. And when you get into the details, you have to recognize that there were some individuals that were writing about the founding of this country. I actually have a booklet on a biblical point of view on the Federalist Papers, which were an attempt to explain why the Constitution was written the way it was. But let's just recognize that even at the time, the writers, and we'll use Benjamin Franklin since that was one of the ones he quotes, they were talking about the ancient Greek city-states that had formed leagues for defense. They were talking about how you had some of these coalitions under the Holy Roman Empire under member states. We even at the time had Switzerland and the Netherlands at the time of the founding had these federalist structures. So to say that the idea of what the Indians were doing modeled democracy, first of all, it wasn't a democracy, but more importantly, it just simply does not look at all of the other texts, all the other founders, all the other things they were writing about at the time. And interestingly enough, there in some of these discussions, he points out, there is no mention of the Magna Carta, no mention of the Glorious Revolution. There is no time given to John Locke or Montesquieu or the ancient Greek democracies or the Roman Republic, or even the fact that a lot of those individuals were actually quoted by the founders. Then getting back to our conversation last week, just think about the Mayflower Compact in 1620. Or think of the 1619 founding of the Virginia House of Burgesses, both made by men who doubtlessly had not even heard a thing about the Native Americans in upstate New York, but then even more so recognized that the Federalist Papers were something which were written in part to try to convince people in New York to ratify the Constitution, and that's where you had the base of the so-called Six Nations of the Iroquois. And yet I encourage you to read the Federalist Papers, or you can read my short little booklet on the Federalist Papers, and you can read James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and there's a few by also John Jay. And when it came time to talk about these different kinds of structures for the government, Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 9 talked about the 23 cities or republics and the assessment that Montesquieu gave of them. And then in Federalist Paper 18, Federalist Paper 19, Federalist Paper 20, Madison reviewed the history of confederacies from the Greeks to the Germans before Charlemagne to Poland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and doesn't even mention Native Americans. I think you get the point. I'm not trying to beat up on Ken Burns, but if that's just one off in the first particular episode, we'll be fine. We'll wait and see what we can learn, but it illustrates again, as we will be talking about tomorrow, exercise some discernment. Just because you see it on a video, just because you see it on a TV screen, just because you even hear it well produced, doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And this one is a bit of a head scratcher because I think most of us know where the idea of the federalist view of government came from, and it didn't come from the Iroquois nation. Well, that's enough for today. We will certainly get into more of that tomorrow. As always, want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. And I guess we'll all go out and buy a copy of Ken Burns' book and read it for ourselves. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.